remember what happened in July of '69? I think we went to the moon.
That must have been our prom. Could have been, no, it was after the prom. Nah, not that I could recall. You talking about the moon shot?
The year the Mets won the World Series, and I was in high school then, and the nuns brought TVs into every single classroom for a week. Other than that, yes, I do remember the landing on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On July 20th, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped down onto another world. An estimated 600 million people viewed this historic moment, recognizing it as a significant human and technological achievement. But America's moon landing also achieved another goal, one triggered by another historic event that occurred 12 years earlier.
Sputnik.
The first artificial Earth satellite in the world has now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched in the USSR.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
Sputnik was the first man-made object put into orbit that went around the Earth in such a way that everybody could know about it because they could hear it on the radio. And what it jolted people with was the Soviets just sent something across my nation that I couldn't stop.
I guess the American people are alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this. We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Since World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had been engaged in an undeclared struggle, a Cold War.
It's an East-West competition. It's a competition about what's the best way to run your society, a democratic, capitalist society, or a closed, top-down, socialist, heading towards communism society. And one of the ways that this competition played itself out was in a technological race.
This race played out on a global scale, primarily with competing military technologies and threats. In 1949, the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb, prompting a response by America's Office of Civil Defense to better prepare and protect the general public.
He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered.
Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover.
I was in elementary school through the 50s, and there was a protocol of duck and cover, where on the teacher's instruction, everybody would rush and get under their desk in case there was a nuclear bomb that went off, a nuclear attack. So it was an open discussion. Everybody knew it. It was in the news all the time, and it was scary.
Sputnik's successful launch proved that the Soviets had a rocket capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to anywhere in the U.S., and the satellite, while small and harmless, represented a new Soviet threat that could be heard and even seen by every American.
The people of the United States have been humiliated, they're disturbed, and they're unhappy.
If Russia wins dominance of this completely new area, well, I think the consequences are fairly plain. Probable Soviet world domination.
To get beyond the Earth and to do things in space, and what a prize for the ideology that got there first.
America's first attempt to launch a satellite.
Further alarmed by the launch of Sputnik 2 less than a month later, the U.S. was then embarrassed by the failed launch of Vanguard, its first satellite. But by mid-1958, with the success of the Explorer series, America finally had a foothold in space. Still, there was a need to formalize the country's space initiatives and to do so with public support. So in July, Congress created NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration.
So NASA is formed as the Civil Space Agency, but inside NASA's DNA, inside of the way NASA is built, and the expertise used to form the agency and to carry out its operations, lots and lots and lots of military experience. But officially, their purpose was the peaceful development of space.
NASA soon created the Mercury program with the goal of putting a man in space as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the Soviets were first again when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin successfully orbited the Earth in April 1961. And while astronaut Alan Shepard's brief flight a month later was celebrated, there was no question which country led the space race when then-President Kennedy addressed Congress only 3 weeks later.
The dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take.
They have done it first. They have sent a man into orbit first. So what's the next thing?
Yeah, do you want to go to the moon?
No, there's no fish there, and I love fishing.
Yes, I do.
Really?
Yes.
Why do you want to go to the moon?
Because I want to see how it is up there.
Part of me says yes, part of me says no, because I'm afraid something happening when I'm up there and not ever coming back.
Who's going to do that first? Maybe that is the way to regain the lead.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
It's a big, long, difficult, to some nearly impossible project. But then again, that's what he challenged people to do. And what did he say? We're not doing these things because they're easy. We do these things because they're hard. And that was a signal not only to Americans, it was a signal to everybody else as well in that cultural East-West competition.
To meet Kennedy's goal meant that NASA had to develop a long-term plan with intermediate objectives. Project Mercury had gotten a man into space. Now Project Gemini began, with the goal of developing the space travel techniques required for a moon mission. This included researching and developing the technology necessary for such a journey. Given the tight time frame, NASA knew it would need help from private industry and suppliers such as DuPont.
One of the things that is a hallmark of DuPont's interaction with NASA is this public-private partnership, that this is something with which DuPont had a long history, the most visible being in wartime, working with the Army, the Navy, the Air Corps, later the Air Force, and coming up with propellants, explosives, but then also with other materials like paints and varnishes, industrial chemicals, a whole product line which came out after World War I.
One of the reasons DuPont had such an extensive product line was their approach to and long history of innovation.
In 1902, one of the things that they started was a research and development program. So you start the experimental station here in Wilmington to do completely theoretical work. But that's a hallmark of their program is you can go in and think up these things. That a lot of DuPont's big products are things that they didn't deliberately set out to figure them out. A lot of them were more incidental or accidental. So the discovery of things like nylon, that's not something they set out to do. That ended up being something they happened into.
DuPont's focus on theoretical research resulted in numerous materials that had found use in America's post-war society, the same materials NASA would now need to reach the moon. Other established companies with similar research arms, such as AT&T with its Bell Labs, were partnered with NASA as well. The telecommunications giant was also making its own investment in space by building Telstar, the world's first telecommunications satellite. Both these ambitious undertakings required innovative new materials, which provided opportunities for smaller fledgling enterprises such as W.L. Gore and Associates.
The company was founded in 1958, and that was really at the very beginnings of computerization. And my dad thought that these computers would need interconnects, wires that connected the computer to the visualization screen or to whatever.
Working with a fluoropolymer called PTFE, the company created Multitet, a flat, flexible ribbon cable that met the harsh requirements of operating in space.
Lightweight, insulative electronically, flexible in all different temperatures, compact, and so on. So it was a natural that this would be a great, product for aerospace.
Both NASA and AT&T recognized the value of Gore's products. AT&T installed Gore's wire and cable in Telstar, which they successfully launched in July 1962 and which began transmitting a day later.
Telstar was really exciting. I remember looking up in the sky, and you could really see it, and to think that we had something in there, it was just fantastic. It was beyond dreams.
Gore continued supplying innovative materials to NASA as the U.S.-Soviet space race focused on preparing for a manned lunar landing. By February 1966, the Soviets had an unmanned probe on the moon. NASA quickly followed with Surveyor 1, the first of 7 unmanned Surveyor probes, many of which used reliable Gore products. Meanwhile, NASA was now well along with Project Gemini, which had the goal of demonstrating human and equipment endurance during prolonged space flights. This meant not only developing larger and more advanced spacecraft, but designing protective suits for the men who would fly them.
If you look at the scale of the whole Earth, even moving a little bit up into the atmosphere makes it impossible for human beings to breathe and live. So when you leave the comfort zone of sea level or so, you have to take the atmosphere with you.
The Surveyor probes had confirmed that the moon had almost no atmosphere in which to breathe or even protect an astronaut from the sun's radiation. Yet the goal was to have a man not only survive, but work in this hostile environment.
Try building a vessel around a human being containing a pressurized atmosphere that still allows that person to do effective work. It's going to be very difficult to move in. It's going to be really hard to regulate your body temperature. It's going to be very difficult to eliminate, to communicate, to do all sorts of things that we take for granted when we're at our sea level comfort zone.
NASA was familiar with high-altitude flight suits for its pilots, but a lunar walking suit demanded a completely different design. Fortunately, there was a Delaware company familiar with producing flexible garments shaped to the human form, Latex.
It does make sense that a company like Latex and later ILC would get involved in something like building a flexible pressure vessel around a person. They've been working with flexible, impermeable fabrics before.
During World War II, Latex ILC had supplied the military with a number of soft good items, including rubber rafts and canteens. After the war, the company focused on expanding its consumer product line, but it also kept a close eye on the government's emerging space program, even anticipating NASA's possible need for a moon suit.
I came to ILC in 1960. And they had been working for a year or two on company money on an idea to make a walking suit. They decided to get into the space business. They didn't want to try to beat the incumbents at their own game, which was what they wanted to step ahead of them and be the people who could make the moon suit.
ILC engineers had years of experience producing soft garments that covered and moved with the human body, so they understood where the suit's earliest design challenges would be.
When George Durney and Len Shepard set out to design this suit back in the 50s, they were real smart in how they built the convolute. The rubber convolute, the way it bent and flexed, played a huge role in how the flexibility of that suit turned out.
Convolutes were rubberized, flexible bellows used to cover the elbows, knees, shoulders, all the joints where the human body bends. In 1965, NASA reopened the bidding for a redesigned lunar suit needed for the Apollo missions.
One thing we were sure of, nobody was making the bellows. We didn't have to worry about that. They wouldn't be in the program long enough to make a bellows.
Even with their innovative design, it took an enormous effort for ILC to meet NASA's bid deadline.
So we had 6 weeks to build a suit and put it into this competition. And it was 6 weeks of 24 hours a day work with a very limited staff. You had George, a handful of engineers, a few seamstresses, and they were able to put this suit together and put it into the competition, and long story short, we end up winning.
ILC's suit design secured the contract, but now the small Dover company not only had to meet NASA's production schedule, but also fulfill the government's reporting requirements.
They were dealing with a company that was an offshoot of the bra and girdle company. We were commercial. We weren't an aerospace company. We had no systems engineering. We had no configuration management know-how. We had none of that. We just had a couple guys that were, kind of good at making spacesuits. And we had good sewers. We had ladies that could take the ideas of the engineers and make it all come together.
The contract was large and ILC small. So was the local workforce. Dover only had about 12,000 residents in the mid-60s, so the company had to recruit skilled workers from out of town.
I worked for a contract company in Philadelphia, M&T Company, and I got a call one day to go to Dover, Delaware for an assignment to work on the early spacesuits. Dover's a small town. We didn't have the malls yet. Lockerman Street was the center of town. A lot of people that came to work at ILC were from larger cities, and we all thought it was kind of funny that in town would shut down at 5 o'clock.
Along with more draftsmen and engineers, ILC needed more skilled seamstresses. Fortunately, the area had a number of shirt and luggage factories with a workforce from which to recruit.
I just got out of high school, and one of the first jobs I had was working at Leeds Travelwear. They were hiring at ILC for seamstresses that they needed to work on their Apollo spacesuits. So when I applied, I knew that's what I was applying for.
I was working in a dress factory, and they needed sewers. I don't know if I even knew Kennedy said that we were going to the moon. I suppose I heard it, but it didn't really sink in.
I met my supervisor, and she said, "Very nice meeting you." I said, "Nice meeting you, and here's the test that you have to take."
ILC tested the abilities of each potential seamstress, knowing that the company's success and the astronauts' survival ultimately depended on those who would sew the suits.
They were the cream of the crop, really, and they were all experienced sewers. There were a lot of qualifications they looked for other than just being able to sew.
But before the suits could be sewn, they needed to be designed and the materials tested. Although ILC engineers took 77 measurements of the human body, there was no way to simply engineer a suit.
Engineering is sort of precise. When you get done engineering something, you should have it completely done. We sort of did it backwards. We made the product science, and then if it was a little inefficient, we engineered the back end of it.
George and Len, they came from the School of Hard Knocks, meaning you don't learn it in an education system, you learn it from hands-on doing it.
This meant repeatedly testing different materials and the handiwork of the sewers.
All the seam samples we made would go straight to the test lab, and they would test them until they tore.
But the engineers didn't sew. And so sometimes the ladies had to speak up.
Yeah, we told them what we thought, because you try to do something, you can't do it. But sometimes they had really great ideas, and they didn't look like they would work, but when you tried it, wow, it worked.
There was also the hardware that had to be attached and sealed to the garment.
There was no simple job of installing hardware on any of these suits. You installed, but you also sealed that hardware into that suit. And just about everything that we sealed to or with, it was up against the neoprene that held the air.
Despite the challenges, ILC made steady progress.
We were moving along with our normal bumps and difficulties, and then Block 1 had to fire.
In January 1967, disaster struck the space program. A fire inside the Apollo 1 capsule killed 3 astronauts. Although they were not wearing ILC suits, the tragedy resulted in NASA not only demanding safer spacecraft, but safer suits.
We were using Nomex, a normal race car, Air Force pilot, fire-resistant material. Wouldn't come close to meeting the 1200-degree requirement that came out of the Block 1 fire. So we had to change every external material.
Fortunately, researchers at Corning Glass had just developed a flexible yarn made of 19 hair-thin glass fibers.
Let's try taking the 19 twists and coating with Teflon, and then weaving them in a fabric after that. Voila, that worked. Became the outer layer for everything.
This practice of combining innovative new materials with established consumer products was done throughout the Apollo program and was a critical success factor in NASA meeting Kennedy's deadline.
Many of the products that went into the space program were not brand new materials. They were already developed here on Earth, but we found new uses for them.
The ILC team was steadily overcoming the new design challenges, but NASA's new safety requirements added to the burden of an already tight delivery schedule.
Go into work at 8 o'clock, go out for lunch, and work till 8:30 at night, work Saturdays, and this went on for about a year and a half. And everybody worked the same hours. The sewers, the designers, the draftsmen, the engineers.
It made it a little hard for families at home. Children couldn't understand what was so important that kept you away, and meals weren't always on time, or they had to kind of find their own food.
But the company also made sure there were occasional social activities to break up the long hours.
When you worked together for all them hours, it was most enjoyable to get out and enjoy company away from work. So there were get-togethers at the Sambos was one of the favorite places. I remember I bowled on a bowling league.
I was on the bowling team. We went to the dances, my husband and I.
Sometimes when we worked, we had what they called Rainbow Inn. And there was maybe a dozen of us would go up after work and have a drink and play ping pong or whatever and relax and had a good time.
So we did have that togetherness even after we left work.
But back at work, there was no getting around the discipline needed to guarantee a safe suit. No one material could address all the challenges of the harsh lunar environment, so layers of fabric had to be cut, assembled, and sandwiched inside one another. Cutting the patterns for each successive layer required not only math skills, but an understanding of the properties of each different fabric.
On some patterns, you would go 3/8 of an inch to extend it to that, but you didn't know on this because this was something that was going to be pressurized, and what type of material it was, but the stretch.
Some of the cut fabric had to be cemented together because it was so thin. Other material, like chromolar, the woven steel fabric used for the gloves, was extremely tough. and extremely expensive.
That time, you're talking back in the 60s, it was over $3,000, approximately about that much a yard for the fabric. And what they had to do, the fabric was locked up. The fabric was put into actually what you would call safes.
In addition to working with an extraordinary range of fabrics, the sewers, or ladies as they were called, had to be incredibly precise.
The sewers did work within a 64th of an inch, which is 15 thousandths. So they were right on top of their game in order to make spacesuit parts. They had to be very, very precise.
Our factory floor didn't go bzzz. Our factory floor went boom, boom, boom.
There were so many nights I could come home and dream about what I had done the day before, because you had to spend so much time taking your time. It was so many stitches per inch. It was so much that you had to measure.
And everyone was inspected by inspectors who were actually super stitchers. They had been promoted to inspectors.
Every seam was checked, and even the number of pins used when stitching.
They had red, blue, green, yellow, whatever, but you could not use the white-headed ones. You know why? Because you can't see white on white, and you might get one left in there.
If the inspector found a pin, of course, you didn't leave it in there on purpose, that was for sure. But anyway, they would stick them with a pin. And sometimes it was in the button.
But even with checks and rechecks, everyone involved had moments of doubt.
Sometimes it was scary when you thought about it, because once they left the earth, they were depending upon your work to keep them alive and well.
I went home and cried and prayed a lot of nights, because I was just praying that that pattern was right, that man come back safe and sound, and nobody got hurt.
These feelings were due partly to the connection the ILC team developed with the astronauts. Since NASA required 3 suits for each Apollo crew member, and each suit customized, every astronaut had to visit ILC several times to be fitted. The astronauts' 2-hour fitting was then followed by a review, or debrief.
In between the fit check physical and the fit check debrief, there was some time, and the crew used to call out on the production floor, and we would have an all-hands call-up, and they would talk to them.
They would come and see us, or we would be invited up to the conference room to meet them, and they would tell us how grateful they are for the work that we're doing.
One of my prized possessions is the photo of my son that Neil Armstrong was kind enough to say a few words and sign his name, Apollo 11, on it.
Along with being fitted, some of the astronauts also got to know a little more about Delaware.
There was one general commander or something, I don't know what it was. But he came down in there and wanted to know one day what it did to me. He said, "You're Mrs. Minor." I said, "No, Mrs. Minor." He says, "From Houston?" I says, "No, from Houston." And then he wanted to know where Reed Booth was. Well, I had to stop and think, because I wasn't too sure what I was talking about. I said, "Are you talking about a beach?" "Yes, ma'am." I says, "You're talking about Rehoboth."
These day-long visits also meant the astronauts could get out and enjoy a bit of local color, often frequenting the Heartbreak in Bowers Beach.
And they always got a kick out of that place because the high tide would come up that street and come up underneath the floors of the Heartbreak Hotel. And there was a pool table that you could put the ball in the center. It would roll. One week it would roll to one pocket, the next week it rolled to the other. The level of the floor was constantly changing due to the flooding.
Ultimately, ILC assembled a 21-layer garment, relying heavily on fabrics developed by another Delaware company.
DuPont provided the materials that went into all the layers, basically, of the spacesuit, starting with the Teflon outer layer, which was totally fire resistant, and it allowed the astronauts the ability to move, all the way down to the inner layers, including nylon and lycra, which held the water cooling tubes that kept the astronaut comfortable. and everything in between.
ILC had assembled a suit primarily by adapting DuPont materials already used in other ways by the American consumer.
There were materials in the spacesuit like mylar and dacron, which formed almost like a thermos bottle in terms of insulation. So the mylar is this shiny aluminum-type fabric, and it reflects the space heat away from the astronaut, keeping the astronaut comfortable. And then the dacron, right behind the mylar, actually formed an insulating air pocket, right? So just like a thermos or like a puffy down jacket, right? It helped keep the astronaut comfortable. And so the combination of all these materials is what it took to get the astronauts the protection they need without the bulkiness, right? I mean, when's the last time you wore 21 layers of anything? So these layers have to be super, super thin. In some cases, as thin as a human hair.
The 21 layers were cemented and sewn into 3 garments that were then inserted inside each other. To complete the suit assembly, ILC built 2 specialized sewing machines.
There were large sewing machines that we had to use in some cases for parts of the suits. Once the suits started coming together, you had to make sure the suit could go into it or under it or around, and it didn't get ripped or torn. So to let you know how big the machines were, I'm 5'9". I could go through the machine. I could crawl right through it. I could go through it. And I told someone, it's not because I guess I could do it, I did it.
With the backpack, the final Apollo suit weighed a little over 200 pounds.
But on the moon, of course, it weighed 1/6 of that. So it weighed 35 pounds. Wasn't much of a load.
In October 1968, NASA launched Apollo 7, the first manned flight since the tragic fire 18 months earlier. This was quickly followed by Apollo 8, 9, and 10. Each mission helped set the stage for the planned lunar landing, and many had relied on the expanded product line of W.L. Gore and Associates.
We had a long record of success in space by the time the lunar landing project came along. So we were pretty confident that our connectors and our products would work well.
On July 16, 1969, with Apollo 11, Gore's products were not only in the rocket and spacecraft, but in the seemingly endless rows of monitoring stations in Houston and at the Cape. DuPont products were there as well, while the astronauts in ILC suits departed for their grand adventure.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Roger, we got a roll program. Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on proper heading.
I know I had a little black and white TV that didn't have very good reception.
It was thundering and lightning out, and I was afraid we're going to lose electric, and I'm really going to be upset.
I just kept praying, just let everything go good.
I was at home in my parents' house watching it on TV.
We're just holding our breath for all that time and just cheering them on. What courageous people.
Through the upper surface of the soil in about 5 or 6 inches of bay.
Delawareans and their companies had helped land men on the moon. Throughout the mission, it had been a matter of nothing failing. Unlike ILC, with its one critical contribution, Gore's products were in use throughout every phase of the mission.
The main spacecraft, the lunar lander, had our connectors. The shovel for gathering rocks had it. The seismograph to measure moonquake-type movements. It was just many, many places. But we were pretty confident, I would say. We had tested it, had been well tested. But, you know, the whole idea of a complex system like that, any one thing that goes wrong can be catastrophic.
DuPont's contribution extended well beyond just the suits. Their materials could be found throughout the rocket and spacecrafts. In fact, the first man-made material to touch the lunar surface was mylar, the same protective golden fabric used in the suits. Finally, there were the suits themselves, and they just couldn't fail. ILC engineers had tested them, but never in a total lunar environment.
We had done all these things piecemeal, but the superposition of all of them together for the system was Apollo 11 because it was undoable on Earth. So that was the thing that strained a little old 31-year-old Homer or something. I wasn't worried about green men jumping out of caves. I wasn't worried about that at all. But I was concerned that we hadn't overlooked anything.
Capcom flight.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent a little over 2 hours working on the lunar surface. Back on Earth, the ILC team witnessed their handiwork finally being put to its first complete test.
I know the engineers and a lot of the other people were really concerned too, whether or not this was going to work.
When they got back into that lunar module, everybody connected with the program breathed a sigh of relief that they were able to do their mission on the moon, and that suit worked perfectly.
With the crew safely on board and headed home, the ILC team had succeeded. And for everyone, like seamstress Iona Allen, who sewed Neil Armstrong's boots, the Apollo 11 adventure was now a unique and treasured memory.
Imagine the pride she had in watching him come down the lunar lander steps and step foot on the moon in the boots that she sewed together. I mean, it had to just be a rush that no one else will ever understand.
3 days after departing the moon, the astronauts were back on Earth. They had jettisoned the lunar lander, so the moon rocks and their suits were all that was left of what had touched the lunar surface, the only relics of an extraordinary and historic journey.
How do you think we benefited from all that space exploration stuff?
Well, I think there were a lot of scientific advances that happened because we went into all that.
I think we probably learned a lot of technology that we don't see, or think about every day.
Yeah, we both did. We both did with that phone there. She watches her cartoons on there. She watches shows in Spanish. She learns sign language.
The race to the moon demanded new and innovative technology that has evolved into many of today's consumer products. And that effort also modeled a way of American enterprise and government working together.
The space program provided an example of achievement and confidence in the way we do things, the way we organize technology and develop things.
Private and public partnerships can really work if you have an ambitious goal, like going to the moon. It doesn't matter whether you're working for the government or what company you're working for, whatever it is, you're aligned.
That alignment generated the innovative technology that got Apollo 11 to the moon. And it is still practiced by those same Delaware companies partnered with NASA today.
Innovation most of the time results in failure, and these problems that we're trying to solve are tremendously difficult. And so teams coming together in a global way, in a multifunctional way, lots of different experiences, diversity of background is what's essential.
Since Apollo 11, NASA has continued to rely on DuPont, Gore, and ILC Dover to provide innovative solutions in their respective areas of aerospace expertise. Over the past 50 years, Delaware Company products have been used on both manned and unmanned missions, from the International Space Station to the Mars rovers, and even deep space probes. But since 1972 and Apollo 17, no American, or anyone, has ever returned to walk on the moon.
The moon program stopped because we won. Once people walked on the moon in July 1969, you could see the end of the program coming. After that flight, funding went down, public enthusiasm, except for the enthusiasts, started to fade away, and walking on the moon never became old hat, but it also wasn't groundbreaking, the newest, greatest thing.
Now, 50 years later, NASA is considering a manned mission to Mars, a hugely expensive undertaking. Perhaps a beeping messenger like Sputnik from an earthly adversary is needed to challenge America, but that is uncertain. What is certain is that the story of Apollo 11, with his extraordinary vision, focus, and effort, will be forever recognized as one of America's and mankind's greatest accomplishments.
One giant leap for mankind.
I say the fun has just begun. We're on Sputnik #1.
I wouldn't mind going to Mars. It's kind of far, though. That's the only thing. I don't know if I could handle going that far.
That is the most frightening and scary experience anyone could ever do.
Really?
It's a hardship endeavor.
It's a pretty long trip, but if I were 50 years younger, yes.
People up there probably don't want to come there, and the people, they probably don't want us up there either.
No. It's too claustrophobic for me in those little spaceships.
I don't want to go to New York, let alone go to the moon. And Mars, it takes 7 years? Forget it.
I'm ready to be beamed up, but not brought up by a spaceship.
I wouldn't mind going to Mars.
Really? What would you do up there? There's no people.
I don't care. I don't know. But I'll do something. I'll find something to do.